Okay, so first off, is there anybody who didn't get the sample annotated bibliography? I can't remember who I passed it out to and who I haven't. But I have several spare copies, like more than I should have, so I'm worried that I didn't give it to somebody.
No, I got it.
Okay.
I have it.
Okay.
Wait, make sure.
Yeah, everybody check and make sure first.
I don't have it.
Okay, you do not have it. Okay, great. Then it's a good thing that I got lots of them. Okay,
So, like, for the annotated bibliography, okay, so we don't have to, like pick a topic on it, right? It's like,
I think, yeah, like what you should have by the time you do the annotated bibliography, you should at least have 2 texts that you want to write about and a broad topic that you want to discuss.
okay, so like a broad topic, it's something you want to write about, but you don't have to have like that actual broad topic.
No, you don't have to have like the thesis or anything like that yet.
Okay,
Yeah.
cool.
And-
Yeah.
Yeah, because what I'm hoping you'll do is that what I'm expecting you'll do here is that you'll do the research part first and then work up the thesis, right?
Can
So-
we use some of the sources that you gave us?
Absolutely, that's so I give these to you for 2 reasons, right? One is for transparency, so you don't think that all this is just coming out of my own head, right? And secondly, for you to use in your own projects, right? All of the sources that I give you are available mostly through interlibrary loan, right? They're all things that you can get. It might take a couple of days to get some of them, but yeah, it's all stuff that should be accessible to you. Now, does anybody need a quick rundown on how to use the Galileo databases? Or is everybody pretty clear? What's that?
I think I got Galileo.
Okay. One suggestion I want to make to y'all, because it will save you a lot of time in the long run. We do have a reference librarian on campus. His name's John Wilson. You can contact him at john.wilson@gsw.edu. And if you make an appointment with him, right, you bring the assignment sheet with you, you tell him more or less what it is you're working on. You spend 15 minutes with John, it will probably save you hours of doing your own research, right? Or research on your own time. Because it's his job to know our databases inside and out and to know where to find things. So yeah, really do consider making an appointment with John. It will help you out immeasurably.
Does the annotated bibliography include the first source, or is it only secondary sources?
Only secondary sources. Yeah, that does not include your primary sources.
And we only have to do like 5 or 6 of them.
Yeah, to meet the requirement for the annotated bibliography, you need 5.
Okay.
If you have more, you can give me more, but you won't get more points for doing that, right?
Okay, so minimum, nice.
Yeah.
Nice.
And do you want it in this form, or do you want it all, what is it, double space?
No, that format is fine for this. Yeah.
I mean, you said annotated bibliography sample, and I have the paper 2 thing, so that's all I need.
Yeah. And yeah, the instructions for each are all in the paper 2 assignment sheet.
Okay.
So the other thing I've got for y'all here are the sample exam questions for the final. So this should give you plenty of time to prepare for it. Once again, as was the case with the midterm, the final, what was I saying? As was the case with the midterm, the actual questions will be more specific, and will ask you to reference specific texts. But with the questions you've been given here, you should be able to slot specific course texts into those fairly easily.
And this is for everything we've done this semester.
This is for everything, yeah, the final is cumulative, covers everything we've done this semester. I will also give everybody, once we've taken all the vocab quizzes, a list of all the vocab words that might be on the exam, right? Because yeah, some of the things that have been on the quizzes will be on it, some of it won't, right? There are some things that I think it's very important that you know exiting the class. some things that are less important. Now, I did notice that some of you had some difficulty with the terms on the midterm. So what I would recommend doing when you're studying on your own, well, I mean, you also had a head injury. So, you know, we're taking into account that, that might have caused you some memory problems. But the best way to study for the terms part of this is to make yourself flashcards, right? Write the term on one side of an index card, write all the other relevant information on the other side, and just, use that to test yourself or get together and test each other, right?
I'll make a quiz with.
Okay, so does anybody have any questions about any assignments or about the final or about anything?
The annotated bibliography, that is due December 1st. Okay, and the final paper is due December 14th.
That is correct. Yeah.
Okay, and our final is what date?
December 10th.
Yeah, the final is on December 10th. It is, it's the Friday right after classes end. So we have our last class on Wednesday, and then we have the final
3:30 to 5:30.
Yeah. So I'm trying to think about when we might be able to squeeze in a review session. Would people be able to do a review session on Thursday if we did it in the morning? No?
I have to be at work 11:30 to 1:30.
11:30 to 1:30? What if we did it earlier? What if we did it, what if we did a review session, say like 9 to 10? Would people be able to do that? Would that work for you?
Yeah, I can just take off that day.
Okay.
Or try to.
Okay.
I'll talk to Ms. Deborah.
Okay, so why don't we tentatively then schedule a review session for 9 to 10 on Thursday the 9th?
Thursday night?
Yep. Yeah, because unfortunately, the way the exam calendar works, there's not a lot of space for us between the last class and the exam itself. And they used to give us a reading day, and they don't anymore, for reasons I don't fully understand, but that are made way above my head and above my pay grade. So, okay. Any other questions about anything relating to final assignments?
But the proposal is still on the 8th.
Yeah, the annotated bibliography on the 1st, the proposal on the 8th. Yep.
Oh, we have a proposal? Okay.
Yep.
I didn't know that.
Is that gonna be open before the 8th or just the 8th?
I can certainly open it before the 8th.
I was just curious.
Yeah. Yeah. And if you want, and as with anything else, if you want me to look at something first before you submit it and get a little feedback first, like, I'm happy to do that too. That's not a problem. Okay. Any more questions?
I think it's it.
Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah, no.
Probably too many things going on.
Yeah, well, like this is fine. I try to leave the beginning of class for questions anyway, just to make sure everything is as clear as possible to all of you. Okay, so let's move on then to the timeline stuff for today. So what have y'all got for me?
Okay, I have 1794, France abolishes slavery in all its territories.
Okay.
And then 1804, the slave rebellion on the island of St. Dominic successful, and the first black state outside of Africa, Haiti, is established. And then in 1807, on the 25th of March, the transatlantic slave trade is abolished by the British Parliament.
Yes, and these French acts actually are relevant to what's going on in Britain because these are often used by pro-slavery campaigners, right, as a kind of threat of, the anarchy that might ensue if Britain followed a similar course, right? So yeah, the fear of the French animates a lot of the things that the Brits do in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. All right, the marker's yours. Caroline, what have you got for us?
Okay, on July 22nd, 1772, James Somerset escaped from his owner in London. That wasn't exactly on that date. What was on that date was the that he went to court. When he was captured, he was put on a ship bound for Jamaica, but Granville Sharp helped him make a case and go to court where Lord William Mansfield said that he should be freed.
Okay.
Not meaning abolishment of slavery, which was a little confused in London, but it was a step in the right direction. November 29th, 1781, 133 Africans are thrown overboard the slave ship Zhong alive during a voyage to Jamaica. The owner of the ship filed a fraudulent insurance claim.
Yeah.
And on March 1783, the case was brought to court, but not for the murder, for the insurance fraud. And this outraged a lot of abolitionists at the time and brought new supporters to their case. 1788, pressure from abolitionists and detailed information gathered on the transatlantic slave trade resulted in the first parliamentary investigation. Thomas Clarkson led the fact-finding mission while William Wilberforce became parliamentary spokesman.
All right, thank you. And yeah, again, a lot of this, stuff that actually has direct bearing on stuff that we're reading for today.
Right,
So
those
yes.
two, I thought those were.
Yeah, those last 2 points in particular, yeah. All right, very good. Yeah, Bethany, what do you got?
In 1786, Thomas Clarkson's an essay on slavery and commerce of the human species is published. In 1790, Wilberforce's first abolition bill is rejected by Parliament. And in 1807, the act to abolish the transatlantic slave trade is passed in Parliament.
All right, thank you. So when Caroline is done with the marker, you may proceed up there. But yeah, so really good set of stuff today, guys. So one thing, so obviously today we're talking about the transatlantic slave trade and the way it was perceived in Britain at the end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th centuries, right? So how much do y'all know about the transatlantic slave trade?
That it came from Africa, right? It was the taking slaves from Africa, or free men from Africa, and saying that they're going to be promised or whatever, like, land and food and such or whatever, and then taking them to be slaves for Britain and other places.
Almost.
Kinda?
Yeah, most of the people who were being picked up in Africa actually were already enslaved.
Oh, okay. How about?
They were kind of like, they were captured often, and they were often prisoners of war. And prisoner of war, as the slave trade ramped, the international slave trade ramped up, became a very kind of dodgy definition. As greedy chiefs in particular began raiding other villages to get slaves to sell. But yeah, they'd be gathered in a region called the Gold Coast. The European sailors would come, they would trade usually manufactured goods, textiles, rum, often weapons, in exchange for slaves, who they would then bring to the Americas, particularly to the West Indies. That was usually kind of like the first stopping off point. And in North America, they would pick up things like sugar, tobacco, and cotton, right? Essentially raw material, for the most part, raw materials to be made into manufactured goods in Britain, but also certain luxury goods, right? And one cannot overstate the importance of sugar to the trade triangle in general. So here we have illustrated the transatlantic trade triangle. Right, so up here, right, coming down from Britain, especially from ports like Liverpool and Bristol, ships come down, trade textiles, rum, and manufactured goods in Africa, take slaves to the Americas, bring back sugar, tobacco, and cotton. So sugar is not completely unknown in Europe prior to the 18th century, but it's inferior, right? European sugar is mostly made from beets. It's lousy.
So now they're getting a taste of raw sugar from sugarcane.
Exactly, yeah. The thing, yeah, sugarcane can't grow in Europe, right? You can't cultivate it in Europe. So these West Indian plantations become enormous profit centers because of the higher quality sugar that is produced there. However, the cultivation of sugarcane is also difficult, punishing, and dangerous. So a number of slaves working these plantations are killed or maimed in the making of sugarcane. So this becomes a big part of the, like, this is why some abolitionists, for example, encouraged sugar boycotts, right? The other thing to note here, too, is the way these kind of products from the colonies become kind of central to various forms of middle and upper class enjoyment, right? So I think we talked a little bit about this on the first day, but it's probably a good idea to revisit it, right? What's the beverage we most associate with the English? Tea, yeah, right, the English love tea. But tea, right, is grown in South and East Asia. It's not native to Europe either. And what do you usually put in your tea?
Sugar.
Yeah. So tea and sugar both enter into Europe in a large way at about the same time. And they're both products of this colonial trade, right? Now, the other thing that we see them bringing down from England to Africa here, right? Does anybody know what rum is made out of?
Coconuts.
It can be flavored with coconuts.
Yeah, I was just kidding.
Captain Morgan is failing me right now.
I know that pirates love it.
That's, yeah, pirates love it. Yeah, okay.
Isn't it made of some kind of leaf? Plant or something?
Well,
Beer,
if you go back far enough, it's a plant.
beer is yeast.
Yeah, beer is made of yeast and wheat, right, and
I
barley.
feel like
Yeah,
everything, every alcohol has got yeast in it.
yeah, it needs yeast to ferment. Yeah, it's still. I'm pretty sure you're not going to get this. It's okay.
100%.
Yeah, rum is made from fermented molasses.
Yeah, see, I wasn't gonna know that.
Now, do y'all know what molasses is, where it comes from?
I know it's sticky, syrupy.
Yeah, it's a sticky black syrup, right?
Yeah, it comes from like a tree of some sort, right?
Actually, it's a byproduct of sugar production.
Doesn't it? Oh. You like made in like Australia or something?
You might be thinking of Vegemite,
Yeah,
which
that's what they
is
do.
disgusting.
Yeah, that's what I
Yeah, Australians love it, no one else does.
Is rum made a product of Europe too?
Yeah, the rum is made in Europe from sugar that's brought to Europe and then refined. And the molasses is then a byproduct of the sugar refining process. And the molasses is then taken and made into rum, right? So the reason I bring this up, right, is to demonstrate the centrality of sugar as an economic good, right? Like it's in now just about everything, right? Just as like when you go to the supermarket now, right? If you check the ingredients of just about any processed food you buy, yeah, for some reason there's sugar in it, even if there really oughtn't to be. So, yeah, sugar is suddenly everywhere. But the people who produce the sugar to the average British person are largely invisible. Right? Or at least that's the argument that's often made in England at the time.
They probably knew about it, they just didn't care.
That's probably closer to the truth. In fact, several of the authors that we read for today suggest exactly that.
I also feel like they just wanted to be the best, so they didn't want to admit to anybody.
Sure, yeah, it's hard, right? When you know that your own pleasures and your own convenience are dependent on someone else's suffering, right? To
Doing all of
admit to
this
that.
To prove that they were the best.
Yeah.
All this sort of
Yeah, well, yeah, I mean, it's also, yeah, like it's emblematic of British power, right? And slavery was a huge economic engine as well, right? So, for example, how many of you have ever heard of Barclays Bank?
I feel like I've heard
Okay, do any of you watch basketball?
it. Yeah.
Okay, the Brooklyn Nets play at the Barclays Center,
Oh, okay.
which is sponsored by Barclays Bank, which is one of the biggest and most prestigious banks in England. So can we guess how the Barclay brothers who founded the bank made their money?
Sugar.
Well, it's even a little dodgier than that.
Oh, slave.
Yeah, exactly. The Barclay brothers were slave traders. And then when the slave trade was abolished, they took their profits and went into banking.
So they make more money.
Yeah. So,
We went to World War II for bankers. That's rude.
but yeah, what was I going to say? Okay, so the Barclay brothers.
Sorry.
It's okay, just got off track there. It's been a long week, right?
Yeah.
I think for all of us. Now, in light of recent protest actions in North America and Europe, have also revised the views that a lot of Britons have about certain historical figures, even people who nobody really remembers that much about. So this statue is of a 17th century businessman and philanthropist by the name of Edward Colston. Colston was one of the city fathers of Bristol, and it was his money that he left to the city in his will that built the city up into what it is today. Right? So he is a major contributor to what becomes a very prosperous port city. But again, there's the question of where Colston got all that money that he left to the city of Bristol. He got it, exactly, he got it mostly through trading slaves. So,
Doesn't a lot of people just get mad if you get money from slaves?
yeah,
Slaves?
it was pervasive, yeah, it was pervasive. So, last year, Eddie Colston finds his way down to the bottom of Bristol Harbor as protesters tore down the statue and hurled it into the water. In fact, for a little while, if you did a Google Maps search for Edward Colston statue in Bristol, it pointed you to the middle of Bristol Harbor. The statue has since been fished out and has been placed in a museum display case while the city figures out what they want to do with this and
I was
whether
about to
they
say,
want
that's
to.
almost worse.
I mean,
Well, I guess,
Maybe not necessarily.
and you learn, but you know,
Mm-hmm.
let them need. They throw it in the water.
The people had spoken, right? It's-
Spoke. Let them stay in the water.
Well, and this is the thing, like, we get into a lot of debates about monuments, right, and about statues and who should be memorialized. And I think, like, on the one side you get people talking about, like, well, it's about history. And, then, other people's like, yeah, but you're memorializing, someone who did not believe that all human beings had the same dignity, right? And in many cases either, traded and sold other human beings or fought to make sure people could still do that.
I think memorials are a waste of time.
Yeah,
Like,
well,
like statues like that, I think they're just a waste of time, because if you're gonna memorialize
Mhm.
people in history, you have to do everybody in history, don't you? Like, you have to we're gonna memorialize Abraham Lincoln. He was he was a big part in history. So was Adolf Hitler. He was a big part in history too.
Well,
Abraham Lincoln was also a slave owner.
yeah, that is,
He didn't really care.
yeah, that is also true.
Slavery,
And-
I don't see the point in memorializing people. You
Yeah.
talk about them, congratulations, you did something with your life. If you don't,
Mhm.
oh well.
Well, and I think I think one of the things that you're kind of like obliquely getting at is that nobody actually learns history from monuments, right? I mean, I don't go walk up to a statue in the park, say, it's like, oh, I know all about George Washington now, I saw a statue of him, right?
Saw that pretty horse. He rode
Yeah.
a horse, I know.
What monuments do, right, is they show us whose history is regarded as important at particular moments in time, right? People who have control over resources and territory put up monuments to people they think are important, right? So it's mostly about who has control of the historical narrative at the time the monument is put up. So you actually can learn things about history from monuments, but not in the way we often think you do, right? You learn more about kind of like history as a process and as a kind of disputed space than you do about history as a set of facts from things like monuments. But the Colston, I don't know if we call it a defenestration necessarily because they're not putting them through a window. We're just throwing them in the harbor. The Colston submerging or ducking, as you will, right?
They reenacted the Boston Tea Party.
Yeah, with a bronze statue. I think kind of like points to the way in much of the West we still haven't really dealt with a lot of the legacy of colonialism. And how much of this is still kind of left unresolved, and how much of the architecture of colonialism, imperialism, and slavery are still kind of like undergirding everything that we, the basic architecture of our lives today, right? So what I'd like to do is kind of turn to some of these texts that we're looking at, and kind of look at how this debate was framed in the 18th century, at the end of the 18th century, the beginning of the 19th. Because I think that this is still something that has a good deal of relevance kind of to contemporary life, right? So the slave trade, as we noted, was abolished in Britain, in British territories. The slave trade is abolished in British territories in 1807. However, slavery itself is not abolished in British territories until 1833. In 1807, They just put an end to the trafficking part of it, right? And even after legislation is passed to set slaves in British territories free, they're put on a kind of an apprenticeship system where they still have to serve their masters for a period of 7 years before they can be freed. And even like once that is out of the way, Britain finds a new cheap labor force in South Asia and starts migrating people from what are now India and Pakistan to the West Indies to provide not a free labor force anymore, but a cheap labor force. So they kind of find new ways to perpetuate the old cycle. Now, one of the key abolitionist voices in Romantic era Britain was William Wilberforce, whom I think a few of you mentioned, and who was also referred to in several of the texts that we read for today. So Wilberforce, born 1759, died 1833. So he dies the same year that slavery is abolished in British territories, is remembered as a philanthropist, an abolitionist, and a member of Parliament. Right, so he was one of the key figures advocating for abolition through relatively moderate legal means. Right, Wilberforce was not a radical, and was in fact opposed to anything that smacked too much of radicalism or French-like behavior, right? No Jacobins lurking around William Wilberforce anywhere. In fact, a lot of his positions, apart from his position on the slave trade, were actually quite conservative. For one thing, he was anti-trade union. Right, he did not believe that workers should be allowed to organize to bargain with their employers. He also opposed Catholic emancipation, right, granting full citizenship rights in Britain to Catholics, at least until 1813. And he also supported laws that limited the right of citizens to protest, or even simply to gather in groups of more than 50 people. So while his work for the cause of abolition, it was vital to the success of that particular cause, this is another one of those historical figures who does also have a slightly more complicated legacy, right? Now, Wilberforce was an evangelical Protestant. He was converted as a relatively young man to evangelical Methodism. And do we remember from earlier in the semester, we talked about the dissenting denominations or dissenting traditions in Britain? Do we remember what that meant, what dissenters were?
Dissenting from their religion. It was like not quitting, but like changing, or maybe.
You're thinking along the right lines, right? So what's the official state religion in England from Henry VIII on to Protestant, yeah. But more specifically, Anglican, yes. The Church of England is the official state church So dissenting denominations are non-Anglican Protestants. So Quakers, Baptists, Methodists, Presbyterians.
So William was a dissenter.
Yeah, he was a dissenter. In fact, the dissenters were, by and large, the biggest supporters of abolition. It was these dissenting denominations where abolitionist thought was most clearly articulated and most closest to the value system, right? Now, this was partly because the Anglican Church, as a state agency, also made a lot of money on the slave trade. In fact, the head of the Anglican Church was the king, and the kings of England were partners in a venture called the Royal Africa Company that was primarily concerned with the trade in slaves. So even like the very coffers of the government are being filled through this particular trade, right? Right, it's everywhere, it's pervasive. So Wilberforce advanced the first bill for abolition in 1791. And it was in like a kind of cap to a series of incidents that had exposed, in particular, some of the cruelties involved in the slave trade. So I think one of you mentioned a moment ago the Zhong Incident, right? So can you recapitulate that for us a bit?
You mean read it again?
Yeah. That is exactly what I mean.
Sorry. Okay, 133 Africans are thrown overboard the slave ship Zhong alive. During the voyage to Jamaica, the owner of the ship filed a fraudulent insurance claim for the value of dead slaves. In March 1783, the case was brought to court, but not for the mass murder, for insurance fraud. This outraged abolitionists brought new supporters to their cause.
Yeah. So the captain of this ship, the Zhong, argued in court that he had to throw 133 slaves overboard because of fever on the ship and a shortage of water, right? Those were his arguments. Now, what he was trying to do, again, was, claim insurance money. Because otherwise, the people sponsoring this voyage would have lost money on it. So what is the fact that he could throw 133 people overboard and be tried for insurance fraud rather than murder tell you about the legal status of those people? Well, they did have a legal status, right?
They didn't count.
They were
Yeah.
just parts. They were.
Exactly.
They were. I can't think
With
of
the 16 or something like that.
Pardon?
They're just means to an end.
Yeah, well, they're property, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But they were just things they were trading. It was like they had sugar and they just threw it over.
Yeah.
Same thing.
Yeah, you're right. It would have been no different than if they'd thrown
Cargo.
sugar, cargo, or
They're
they're, yeah, I mean, like the result, like the case would have been no different if they'd thrown out, textiles or rum or whatever, right? Yeah, exactly.
mean, why, but I don't understand why they couldn't just appear in Jamaica, let people disappear, and then act like they had to come up.
Well, and I think it's because they didn't think of them as people,
Yeah, just saying.
right? I mean, you have.
I know, but I wouldn't do that with tigers or lions or,
Mhm.
you know,
Yeah,
I'm just saying.
yeah, no, I mean, and yeah, I mean, it does, I mean, it seems to be like particularly cruel and depraved, right?
They were just trying to save their own hide.
Yeah.
They wouldn't
Or-
have any slave trade if they were all dead.
Mhm. Well, and on top of that, right, you know, they're essentially, they're trying to save money, right? They're trying to make sure that the voyage is profitable. And, you know, it kind of, you know, makes one think, like, how many other times did this happen, right?
Oh, no, a lot.
Probably, yeah, and the perpetrators just weren't caught, right? Now, the proprietor of the Zong, like the captain of the Zong, was supremely unlucky in that his claim that there was a shortage of water was belied by the fact that there was a known rainstorm where the ship was at the time that he did this. So he couldn't actually claim that he didn't have enough water for everyone on the ship.
It rained for like 3 days straight.
Yeah, yeah. So water shouldn't have been a problem. This is where he got tripped up, right? Just this one little detail here.
And even if they were feverish,
Mm-hmm.
like, the way that they kept them on the ship, how would they get it?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if they're gonna say that they were fevers or whatever, they could have like came on, like, they had like diphtheria or something, you know? Like, or something, but.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think, like, whenever we hear about something like this, right, like we always, like, we want to try to find a solution or rationalize it in some way, right? But it's hard to get into, it's hard for us to get into the mindset of a late 18th century slave trader, right? And to understand why this person would have made this kind of decision. And the best I can do imaginatively is, again, to say that, like, it's easier to do this sort of thing to people when you don't think of them as people.
And or when you just don't really realize, like, know any better, like, you just think that it's, yeah.
Mhm. Yeah.
It just doesn't make, it makes sense, but it doesn't, like, that makes
Mhm.
sense, but it doesn't.
Yeah, because
Yeah.
they were raised like that.
Mhm.
If you're raised to think that something is property, you're always.
Right,
gonna
they
believe
were
it's
raised to
property.
believe that they were savages, like,
Yeah.
so that's what they believe.
Well, and yeah, like this, I want to lead into now some of the arguments that were made around the period in like some of the common pro-slavery arguments, right? So some of them were economic, and we actually see some of this in the William Cobbett piece. So we've already seen, like, kind of generally how central economically slavery was to Britain's period, right? But the argument went that the colonies provided both raw materials for British goods, right? You want cheap cotton to keep coming, right? You want cheap tobacco. You want cheap lumber to keep coming in from the Americas. And the luxury goods that the upper and middle classes were increasingly dependent on. And so, ending slavery would ruin the colonies economically. And as such, because you're not getting the raw materials anymore, British factories would grind to a halt. So this was the economic argument, right? And this was the argument that was one of two arguments that was most frequently made in Parliament. right? We can't do anything about this because to do anything about this would destroy the economy. There were also, believe it or not, moral arguments. There were people who argued that enslaved people were in fact being rescued from even worse conditions of slavery in Africa. This, of course, was not strictly true. While slavery did certainly exist in West Africa as well, as we said, slaves were largely prisoners of war, were often able to ransom themselves, and were typically not made to do anything that anyone else in the community wasn't also made to do. They just weren't free to leave. Which is still problematic, but not in quite the same ways. And there were religious arguments. Right? People would frequently quote scriptures or cite examples from Scripture that seemed to them to permit or even encourage slavery. And there were those who argued that slaves made easy converts to Christianity. So, by enslaving someone, you are actually giving him the chance to save his soul. I know, yeah, it sounds fucked up, right?
The way you
It
say
is.
make easy converts, that's not what we're supposed to do. It's missionary, you're supposed to, it's a mission.
Yeah, but like
Shove it down the throats.
well, and again, like part of what's happening here is it's people are trying to justify morally to themselves an existing system, right? Because in large part because their own comforts might be disrupted if anything happens to this system, right? So you find we all do this, right? We make arguments to ourselves that support what we already think or what's easiest for us, in order that we don't have to change anything. Because change is hard, change is uncomfortable, and change on a societal level. When you've built much of your economy and much of your society around slaveholding, the very idea of change, particularly to the people at the top who are propped up by this whole system, right? The very idea of change is too frightening to contemplate. So people like Wilberforce, who want to tear all this down, are incredibly scary and incredibly threatening to the religious and political establishment, and to large business owners as well, right? So I want to take a look for a minute at the Thomas Clarkson piece, not where he talks about the Zhong, but the conversation he has in his imagination with an African who is explaining to him how slavers go about their work, right? So can I get somebody to start reading from the bottom of page 98 with, "I shall suppose myself in a particular part of the continent of Africa."
I shall suppose myself on a particular part of the continent of Africa and relates a scene.
which from its agreement with unquestionable facts might not reasonably be presumed to have been presented to my view had I been actually there.
And first, I will turn my eyes to the cloud of dust that is before me. It seems to advance rapidly and accompanied with dismal shrieks and yellings, to make the very air that is above it tremble as it rolls along. What can possibly be the cause? I will inquire of that melancholy African who is walking dejected upon the shore, whose eyes are steadfastly fixed upon the approaching object, whose heart, if I can judge from the appearance of his
Countenance. His face. Yep.
must be greatly agitated. Alas, says the unhappy African, the cloud that you see approaching rises from a train of British slaves. They are going to be ships behind you. They are destined for the English colonies, and if you will stay here but for a little time, you will see them pass. They arrived here about 2 days ago from the inland country. I saw the fleet come in, which I had gone to fetch them, and upon looking into the canoes, found them lying at the bottom with their hands and feet being tied together. As soon as they were landed, they were conveyed to the houses of black traders, which you see at a little distance, where they were immediately boiled and fed and made up for sale.
Okay, we can pause here for a second, right? So first off, is Clarkson describing something he has actually witnessed himself? Oh, yeah, so he notes from the outset that he is conjuring an imaginary situation, right? Right? Saying sort of like, if I happened to be on the coast of Africa at a particular time, this is the sort of thing that I might see happening, right? And what do we make of the way he describes the thing that he sees coming?
Describe the clouds.
Okay.
Instead of sails.
Well, it's not a ship that he sees coming, right? They've been on canoes, but they're coming over land, right? They're not on the ship yet. They're being brought to the coast to be sold and shipped out, right? But why do you think he describes it as a cloud of dust accompanied with dismal shrieks and yelling? Okay, yeah, many people walking, right, and lamenting as they do so. But can he clearly see what's coming? Yeah, the cloud of dust obscures from his vision what's there, right? Now let's go a little further down here. Can I get somebody to start reading page 99 near the body? But he is gone forever from their sight at the end of that last full paragraph, and they must now be disconsolate.
Being certain by his delay that he must have fallen into the hands of Christians. And now, as I have mentioned the name of Christians, a name by which the Europeans distinguish themselves from us, I could wish to be informed of the meaning which such an appellation may convey. They consider themselves as men, but as unfortunate Africans, who they term heathens, as the beasts that serve us. But how different is the fact? What is Christianity but a system of murder and oppression? The cries and yells of the unfortunate people who are now soon to embark for the regions of servitude have already pierced my heart. Have you not heard me sigh while we have been talking? Do you not see the tears that now trickle down my cheeks? And yet these hardened Christians are unable to be moved at all. Nay, they will scourge them amidst their groans and even smile while they are torturing them to death. Happy, happy heathenism, which can detest the vices of Christianity and feel for the distresses of mankind.
Okay, so what is, and remember, like, so this is Clarkson putting words into the mouth of the imaginary African he's talking to, right? And how does he think an African would perceive Christianity? Yeah, I mean, if the only Christians they have experience of, right, are these slave traders.
Torturers.
Yeah. They're going to think of Christians, right, as torturers, slavers, and murderers, right? And Clarkson himself, by the way, is a dissenting minister, right? So Clarkson is not meaning to cast aspersion on Christianity as a religion, but he is intending to cast aspersion on some of his countrymen's, as he sees it, selective practice of it, right? But, I reply, you are totally mistaken. Christianity is the most perfect and lovely of moral systems. It blesses even the hand of persecution itself and returns good for evil. But the people against whom you so justly declaim are not Christians. They are infidels. They are monsters. They are out of the common course of nature. Their countrymen at home are generous and brave. They support the sick, the lame, and the blind. They fly to the succor of the distressed. They have noble and stately buildings for the sole purpose of benevolence. They are, in short, of all nations, the most remarkable for humanity and justice. But why then, replies the honest African, do they suffer this? Why is Africa a scene of blood and desolation? Why are her children wrested from her to administer to the luxuries and greatness of those whom they never offended? And why are these dismal cries in vain? Alas, I reply again, can the cries and groans with which the air now trembles be heard across this extensive continent? Can the southern winds convey them to the ear of Britain? If they could reach the generous Englishman at home, they would pierce his heart, as they have already pierced your own. He would sympathize with you in your distress. He would be enraged at the conduct of his countrymen and resist their tyranny. So why is Clarkson suggesting here that the good-hearted Christian people of Britain allow this to happen? Yeah, he says.
Or they don't understand it.
Yeah, he suggests that, well, people just don't know, right? How could they when they live so far away and they don't see this directly happening, right? And then the final sentence quoted here actually undermines that whole argument, right? But here a shriek unusually loud, accompanied with a dreadful rattling of chains, interrupted the discourse. Right? He doesn't get to finish his thought because he hears an incredibly loud shriek and rattling of chains, right? So how does that undercut the argument he's trying to make? That we just don't know, and if only we knew, right? If only we could see.
They're the ones doing it.
Yeah, they are the ones doing it, right? And I think what's going on here is kind of like, how could you not hear that, right? If you don't hear that, it's because you're not listening. If you don't hear that, it's because you've kind of closed yourself off to it. You're doing the thing like the three monkeys with the, hear no evil, see no evil, speak no evil, right? Exactly, yeah. You don't hear it because it's convenient for you not to hear it, right? Which is basically the same argument that Anna Letitia Barbald is making in her poem, right? Do y'all know what an epistle is, by the way? What's that?
I said yes, but I couldn't.
Okay, so an epistle is a letter in verse. Right? So it's a poem that's written in the form of a letter addressed to some person. Right? And it's a very, very common 18th century form. Right? Epistles are all over the 18th century. And Anna Letitia Barbald is one of those kind of transitional figures between Romanticism and the earlier kind of Age of Reason poetry, right? So this is, the epistle belongs mostly the so-called Age of Reason, but in this case, Barbald is employing it in an argument about human freedom, which is pretty typically romantic. And I want to look at page 46 here. There's this long verse paragraph that starts here with, in vain, right? In vain to thy white standard gathering round, wit, worth, and parts and eloquence are found. In vain to push the birth of thy great design, contending chiefs and hostile virtues join. All from conflicting ranks of power possessed, to rouse, to melt, or to inform the breast. Where seasoned tools of avarice prevail, a nation's eloquence combined must fail. Each flimsy sophistry by turns they try, the plausive argument, the daring lie, the artful gloss that moral sense confounds, the acknowledged thirst of gain that honor wounds, bane of ingenuous minds, the unfeeling sneer, which sudden turns to stone the falling tear. They search assiduous with inverted skill for forms of wrong and precedents of ill. With impious mockery wrest the sacred page and glean up crimes from each remoter age. Wrung nature's tortures, shuddering while you tell, from scoffing fiends bursts forth the laugh of hell. In Britain's Senate misery's pangs give birth to jests unseemly and to horrid mirth. Forbear, thy virtues but provoke our doom, and swell the account of vengeance yet to come. For not unmarked in heaven's impartial plan shall man, proud worm, condemn his fellow man. And injured Afric, by herself redressed, darts her own serpents at her tyrant's breast. Each vice, to minds depraved by bondage known, with sure contagion fastens on his own. In sickly languors melts his nerveless frame, and blows to rage impetuous passion's flame. Fermenting swift, the fiery venom gains the milky innocence of infant veins. There swells the stubborn will, damps learning's fire, the whirlwind wakes of uncontrolled desire, sears the young heart to images of woe, and blasts the buds of virtue as they blow. So that's a lot, right? But let's try to unpack some of this here. Right, so first off, why won't Wilberforce's impassioned speeches in Parliament do anything to alleviate these conditions? What's the force he's up against? Yeah. Where seasoned tools of avarice prevail, right, a nation's eloquence combined must fail. So what's avarice? Does everybody know what avarice means? Okay, so avarice is greed, right? And to be Wilberforce himself is an upper middle class rich white man. So he belongs to the same class that he's kind of pushing back against here. And as we already noted, wasn't progressive in a lot of other areas of his politics. But yeah, we're avarice, right? Greed, self-interest, right? So where self-interest prevails, eloquence fails, right? You can't convince somebody who's only motivated by greed to drop habits that that make them money. And as we get to the end of this long verse paragraph, right, she's talking about the potential results of continuing the slave trade, right? The idea she seems to be getting at is that if the trade is not abolished, and if slavery itself is not abolished, then the people you've been enslaving, because you have kept them oppressed, and because you have not let their minds develop to help them to think on higher things, they will turn against you and rebel and burn your pretty buildings down, right? You know, she says, you know, the whirlwind there swells the stubborn will, damps learning's fire, the whirlwind wakes of uncontrolled desire, sears the young heart to images of woe, and blasts the buds of virtue as they blow, right? So if you don't give people the chance to develop a virtuous system of ethics, right, then they're not going to have any qualms about turning their ire on you and doing to you what you've done to them. So I get that this has not been a cheery discussion. This has actually been probably about one of the most depressing topics we could discuss just before the break, right? But does anybody have any questions about anything before I give you the reading questions for next time? So the next things we're going to be looking at are excerpts from autobiographies written by former slaves. And one of them, Olaudah Equiano, undertook the first book tour in English history, which I think is actually a pretty cool and interesting fact. And we'll kind of talk about why he did this when we come back. I hope all of you have a relaxing break. Enjoy whatever your particular holiday tradition is.